I'm now joined by the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. Very good morning to you, Therese Coffey. Lots to talk about this morning. But first of all, I wonder what your reaction is to Elon Musk completing his takeover of Twitter. Is that something to be welcomed, do you think?
Well, it was certainly a big move by Elon Musk, much trailed and started to negotiate early in the year. But I think it's significant he's decided to invest in this social media site. Although admittedly as a politician at times it feels like an anti-social media site. But it's an important way of how people communicate around the world, and we'll see what the next steps are.
Well, yes, he has called himself a free speech absolutist. He's been critical of Twitter's moderation policies. Some people are concerned that relaxing moderation policies could mean that hate speech would be allowed to proliferate. Is that something that worries you?
Well, I think that would be concerning, and it's important that people have these platforms, use them responsibly rather than to promulgate hate. But it's also important to have safety, which is another reason why we're bringing back or carrying on with the online safety bill in Parliament next week.
Donald Trump, US President, former, of course, still banned from the platform at the moment. Elon Musk in the past has described that as foolish. Would you like to see Donald Trump back on Twitter?
I have no view on Donald Trump being on Twitter at all. Candidly, that's going to be a matter for Twitter.
OK, well, let's move on to other issues. You're now Secretary of State for the Environment, as of this week, of course. Why is Rishi Sunak not attending COP27?
Well, I've been to 3 COPs in the past, and the UK hands over the presidency. Alex Sharma will do that on the very first day of COP. But I think it's normally the case that every 5 years the big political COPs happen, and that's when you see, as we saw in Glasgow last year, all the different heads of state and prime ministers coming from around the world. In between, they tend to be more detailed discussions, but other senior ministers, including myself, will be going to Egypt, to Sharm el-Sheikh, for different aspects where we come together to talk about specific issues, whether that's water, nature, energy. But the big push happened last year in Glasgow.
Well, yes, but COP27 is very important, and especially at a time like this, especially when the UN just yesterday said that the climate crisis has reached a really bleak moment and that progress has been woefully inadequate. Is it really the time to just not show up as Prime Minister?
Well, as I say, I'm not aware if, say, President Biden or Macron or any of those other people will be there. It is quite standard practice that every 5 years is the big
that's changing, isn't
gathering.
it? They're putting more emphasis on these annual meetings.
Well, there's always the annual meetings have always been important. I mean, this year in particular, we're seeing also the Convention on Nature. It's called Convention of Biodiversity, as well as one on illegal trade of endangered species. So there's a number of different things coming together. So it's an important year for the environment. But we have held the presidency for the last year, and it's important that we hand that over now to Egypt. But we will continue to do as we are doing, working towards different ways of how we meet our carbon budget domestically, but also the support that we give around the world to different countries and how we take that forward. And we certainly showed leadership last year when we really set ourselves challenging targets, and we will continue, as I say, to work with partners around the world to help them deliver their commitments too.
But what message does it send out to those partners around the world? And given that you're saying that the environment is still a priority, why then, in 48 hours as Prime Minister, has Rishi Sunak not only pulled out of COP27, but he's taken Alex Sharma out of the cabinet, and also the Climate Minister, Graham Stewart, is also out of the cabinet as well. Is this a failure of leadership on the climate issue? Is this no longer a priority?
Not at all. I think it is very much a priority, and the Prime Minister said that in Downing Street. Look, I've returned to DEFRA. I have had 3 years as a minister there before as the environment. We work in partnership right across government in order to deliver our carbon budgets. But as I say, the UK is actually handing over the presidency on the very first day. It's important that we allow the normal COP functions to carry on. But I want to reiterate, several senior government ministers will be attending, and it is normal practice that every 5 years is when the big, if you like, the prime ministers and heads of state tend to attend.
We understand, or reports suggested, that Liz Truss, when she was Prime Minister, advised King Charles not to attend COP27. Will he now be advised that he can go under Rishi Sunak?
I'm not aware that Liz ever advised the King of that, but I'm conscious that King Charles has always taken a very deep interest in the environment and climate change, and of course it would be up to him to decide how he chooses where to put his priorities in his reign as king.
Would you like to see him there?
I think, as I've just explained earlier, normally the big COPs tend to be every 5 years. The United Kingdom hosted that last year, where we had attendance from many members of the royal family. But in between, it tends to be more of a, I'm not going to say low-key, but not quite the same level of heads of state and prime ministers attending.
Would you like to see King Charles go to COP27?
I think it's up to him. I know that he takes an interest in this particular issue, but it's up to him.
There are reports this morning that Rishi Sunak is drawing up plans to expand the windfall tax further on energy companies. That levy stands at 25% at the moment. Will he increase it?
Well, I'm sure that he is working with his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, to explore all the different elements in the run-up to the medium-term fiscal plan, which has been put back by a couple of weeks. I think it's important that the Prime Minister, of course he was the Chancellor beforehand, and can work together with his Chancellor to decide how best to make sure that we have that longer-term budget that will put us back on the path to a percentage debt falling as our debt falling as a percentage of GDP.
But as Environment Secretary, would you like to see that happen?
I think I'm not going to get into discussion about tax, because that really is a matter for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister.
So you've got no view then on whether or not he should expand the remit to include renewables as well?
Well, can I put it this way? Government ministers don't have personal views. This is about governments going through that. The new Prime Minister will be working with the Chancellor to decide where to best recognise the financial situation and how we address that.
Can I move on to Northern Ireland now? Because the deadline passed at midnight tonight for politicians to come together and restore power sharing in Northern Ireland. That deadline has been and gone. The government says that elections will follow. What do you think elections, though, will solve in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think it's regrettable the parties were not able to come together to form that executive. But the law was clear. We passed the legislation that this would happen. And clearly, there wasn't sufficient agreement to be able to avoid the elections. That wasn't in the hands of the government. That was in the hands of the parties representing the different communities in Northern Ireland. I hope that in the next elections will provide us, will be an opportunity for people to reconsider their approach, recognising the New Decade, New Approach agreement that was signed only a couple of years ago, and we need to make sure that we do what we can to work together to try and make that come to fruition.
But realistically, nothing's going to change, is it? The DUP are adamant they will stick to their policy of refusing to return to power sharing unless the Northern Ireland Protocol is removed. And elections are just going to be expensive, and they could make matters worse rather than better with views entrenching.
Well, the Prime Minister spoke to the Taoiseach yesterday, and clearly this is a situation of concern and regret. But I think both this administration, this government, but also the Irish government will be continuing to try and work to try and bring together that government, the formation of the executive after the elections. I met the Deputy Prime Minister, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, last week, and there is clear emphasis that both our government and the Irish government want the executive form, and we will keep up our efforts to do so. Well,
is there any chance that you could bring forward legislation that means that the elections don't have to go ahead? Will they definitely happen, do you think?
They will definitely happen.
OK. Any movement on the talks with the EU over the protocol?
Well, I know that the Prime Minister has always wanted to have a negotiated outcome. Clearly, the Prime Minister was part of the government under Boris Johnson when we brought forward the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, but it's important those talks continue as well.
I want to move on to the issue of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and her return to her position after 6 days of having left it. Still concerns around her breaking of the ministerial code after sharing sensitive information. Lord Blunkett has now said that security services could be reluctant to share sensitive information with the Home Secretary. Does that worry you?
I don't think that's the case. The Home Secretary recognised that she had breached the ministerial code last week, and clearly the Prime Minister has now had a chance to go through this and satisfied himself such that he reappointed Suella to be the Home Secretary. There are very serious matters happening in our country. Of course, our intelligence services and our police will continue to work with the Home Secretary, giving her the full information that she needs in order to be able to make her decisions protecting safety. But of course, also her main priority right now is about the illegal migrations that are happening, the small boats crossing, and I know she'll put her full efforts into that.
And on the subject of immigration, Suella Braverman has said that she wants to get net migration to tens of thousands. Is that now an official government target?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the Prime Minister will be discussing those matters, but the key priority, my understanding, is about tackling the small boats. If I think about, we've stopped nearly 30,000 crossings just in this year, is my understanding. That's what I've been told. And I recognise there are a lot of people here illegally. That's why we strengthened early in the year the law about how we want to handle those cases. But I think that partnership with France is critical. And indeed, the Prime Minister has been raised that, I think, in his discussions with the French President.
So no target on immigration?
I'm not aware there's any change to policy, but the focus, I think, is about illegal migration.
I just want to ask you a quick question about Liz Truss. You've always described as a close political ally, but you're a really good friend of hers, aren't you?
Yes.
Give us an idea of how tough this week's been for her. How's she doing? Have you spoken to her?
I have, of course, been in touch with Liz. She's a good friend. She's with her family, and I think she's enjoying a well-deserved break.
And you were very close to her politically and personally. Were you surprised then that you were given such a prominent job in Rishi Sunak's cabinet?
Well, I worked with the Prime Minister previously when I was at work in pensions, and he was in being the Chancellor. I think I'm known within government as being a person who delivers and gets on with the job. And I was delighted when he asked me to stay in the cabinet and to take on the role of DEFRA Secretary. I've spent 3 years in the department before, so I can hit the ground running. And there are many important issues to deal with there as we continue to want to try and make sure that we leave the world and indeed our country in a better state and for future generations than we inherited.